Hey everyone, it is Ed Gutowski, and what I wanted to do was to just kind of make a sort of a PowerPoint video that kind of gives you an understanding of rhetoric. This will be the same thing as the lecture that I gave, but instead I kind of wanted to just kind of give you some visuals. So I just want to let you know again, right, that I'm super excited about English C 1001. It is a great class, and what this class is going to focus on is it's going to focus on two things. We're going to talk about rhetoric and we're going to talk about argument. So before we can get into talking about argument, we have to talk about rhetoric because rhetoric and argument are linked. You can't have one without the other. So before we get into talking about arguments, we have to define what rhetoric is. And I think, if you take a ground class, what will happen is I'll ask my students in a ground class and they will completely panic. I mean, you should see the looks on some of my students' faces when I say, hey, define rhetoric. You have girls that are starting to cry, guys that are starting to want to just drop class, and then you have students who are just confused. So what I do when in a ground class is I'll ask students, I'll say, how many students have never heard the term rhetoric? And there'll be a few students that'll raise their hands. And then I have a couple of people say, okay, how many people have heard the term rhetoric but aren't certain how to define it? And there'll be some students that raise their hands there. So what I wanted to do was to kind of break down this lecture into we talk about three things. We talk about form, we talk about people who use rhetoric, forms of rhetoric, and then I will give you a definition of rhetoric. So I'll switch to my next slide here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about the people who use rhetoric. And what's interesting is in any class that I can take, a ground class, an online class, there are students who, if I say, who know nothing about rhetoric, but if I say, who are people who use rhetoric? The first people that always come to mind are politicians. Politicians are always associated with rhetoric. So if you think about it, in the last year, you might have heard things like Donald Trump is using rhetoric. I don't know what that means, but I know that I've heard that term. The second group that always associated with rhetoric is lawyers. Lawyers are always associated with rhetoric. And if you think about it, that makes sense because what do lawyers do? They go and make arguments, right? There's our link to rhetoric and argument. Lawyers are the ones who we pay to argue in our behalf. Now, sometimes I'll ask students, I'll say students, who else defines rhetoric? And they'll say teachers, sometimes English teachers. And I think sometimes we can talk about in another discipline what we might use or study rhetoric as philosophers. We think someone like Socrates, Aristotle, Plato. And then I always get students who say, if teachers use rhetoric, students use rhetoric. And students use rhetoric all the time. They just don't know. They're just not very good at it. All right, so then if we just take, look, we've established who people use rhetoric. Then I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. And I generally ask students, hey, how many people have seen, if we know politicians use rhetoric, how many people have seen Donald Trump, or how many people have heard Donald Trump speak? And most students will raise their hands, right? And that opens up the door that a speech can be a form of rhetoric. But then if I ask them, hey, how many of you have seen him speak in person? People will say, well, won't raise their hand. I say, well, how is it that you've heard a politician like Barack Obama or Donald Trump use rhetoric? And they'll say TV. So notice a form of rhetoric can be a speech because that's the most popular way that politicians make arguments. Most of us probably have heard a politician speak through TV. So TV becomes a form of rhetoric. If TV is a form of rhetoric, we can think of radio as a form of rhetoric. We can think of books and newspapers as a form of rhetoric. And books, if we talk about books being a form of rhetoric, the person that uses that is an author. If newspapers are a form of rhetoric, then that means journalists are the people who use it. We can also think of things like the internet, Facebook, social media. These are all forms of rhetoric. So all we've done here is we've talked about the people who use rhetoric. We've talked about forms of rhetoric. Now I'm going to give you my definition of rhetoric, and this will be my definition of rhetoric for the next few weeks of class. And I'm going to define rhetoric as words used to deceive, to manipulate, and to con people. And so what I want you to do is kind of think about, for the first discussion board this week, how you would define rhetoric and why. You can agree with me, you can disagree, but I just want to know how you would define rhetoric and why. And that'll give us something to play with in the next few weeks.